Morticians of Reddit, what is the most bizarre, uncomfortable, creepy, etc. case or situation you've had to deal with? Heard on the news a friend from my youth had been killed. I was terribly sad for him. He never could escape his demons and it led him down some terrible paths. Came into work a few nights later and there he was, face completely bashed in by a rock. This wasn't the first time someone I knew ended up in our morgue, but certainly the saddest. My ex-in-laws were in the death business. They told me a story once about the county attorney whose wife passed away. The family was very wealthy and she had a mouth full of gold fillings. The attorney demanded that my in-laws retrieve the gold from her mouth. This required using a dental drill to drill down her teeth and dig out the gold. My ex-father-in-law complied with the attorney's wishes but was physically ill about having to do such a needless step to this lady. Not a mortician, but in middle school my friend soci dad was. This wasn't a situation about a body, just the mortician himself. He was a single dad and my friend's sister was going to a school dance but hadn't put on much makeup before and she didn't want to be late. So the mortician dad volunteered to do it for her because I put on people's makeup every day. When he finished she looked in the mirror and freaked out. I look like I'm dead. He just nonchalantly said, "What did you expect? I've only ever worked with dead people before," and just walked away. I wish there was a picture of it. She looked like a deranged undead clown. I work with the dead. Procure eyes and corneas for transplant. While I was working on one guy at the medical examiner's office, they brought in another guy whose cats had eaten his face clean. Just his face. Nothing else. It was a sort of decaying, but still somewhat normal looking dude with a bright Halloween looking skull picked clean. Lots of murder victims, gunshots, car accidents, even one train accident, a guy who hanged himself in front of his kids with a dog leash, which was still in the bag with his body, high caliber self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face, with teeth and jaw and bits everywhere and a bunch of gauze stuffed into the remaining hole. Let's not forget the guy in the decommed room who was just a pile of bones, hair, and leathery tissue paired with a bucket of goo. Crazy stuff, but never a dull day. Licensed embalmer here. I've worked for large funeral homes and did coroner removals for a decently large city and currently work as a trade embalmer. I've had lots of suicides. Embalmed a 4-year-old that a cop blew a stop sign and boned their minivan. That one really hurt. But the one that was weird was this. 18-year-old girl hung herself. So I do the embalming like normal even though it sucked having to do that. Now the weird part, I get a text from my friends a few hours later saying that another one of our friend's fiance's sisters killed herself and if I knew anything about it. Which really sucks because my friend's wedding is in 4 days. Turns out that 18-year-old was the sister to the bride. So I have to go to the wedding 4 days later while everyone is still grieving the loss and keep my mouth shut, and I'm the one that embalmed her. This was in a town of about 250,000 people. Doesn't exactly fit the criteria, but I'm gonna tell the story anyway. I come from a smallish town. We have one mortician and everyone knows him. His daughter dated my cousin during this period of time. One year, a different cousin got into a bad car accident right outside of the county and died on impact. Of course, they called it in and he was asked to come down to the scene and retrieve the body. He was told the estimated age of the girl, the make of her vehicle and which direction she was driving on the highway. The age and vehicle make matched that of his daughter who was visiting her boyfriend at the time. He couldn't get a hold of his daughter so he showed up at the scene fully prepared to be picking up his own child. Sadly enough, this scared him so badly that this was the last funeral he ever performed. 8 years later and he still visits my deceased cousin's parents regularly, just to check in. It's clearly stuck with him. Dad was a coroner. Before switching to doctor. I can never remember the details correctly for the medical stuff, but pretty much the body getting examined was a former birthday clown. There weren't any external wounds so he figured the cause of death was internal. The guy had gastroparesis, which to my dad meant, cool, stomach contents should be in good shape. His team opens the dude up and sees this flurry of duck. There's partially digested birthday cake, that edible confetti stuff, ducking streamers, and about a dozen pills of Xanax next to all of it. Dad sifts through the stomach some more and sees what looks like a sponge of some kind. He pulls one out and it's a ducking sponge dino that comes in those capsules you drop in water. He finds more, about a small bime's worth. He thought he was getting ducking pranked. The story pieces together as the clown decided to end it with the Xanax and booze. He gets a store-bought cake and eats it with everything on it, then chases down some dino sponges just for the hell of it. I used to live with my girlfriend that was a mortician. Also being an EMT, I can tell you that nothing prepares you for dealing with a child. Not a mortician, nor is this a mortician specific story. I figure you just want creepy dead body. It was an EMT that got access to bunch of places and experiences cause I am me. Hanging out in the morgue picking the brain of the guy on shift during graveyard at Martin Luther. Had a corpse sit up on one of the gurney while mid conversation. I go pale. He just looks at me and says they do that sometimes. My brother told me a story of when one of his friends was Mortician's assistant. One time he had to work on a guy who had shot himself in the head with a shotgun. He said the guy kinda looked like Sid from Ice Age. That wasn't the worst. However, the worst part is how he felt about the whole situation. He apparently felt disconnected, not registering that this body was once a living man and not just something to clean up. My brother said he quit that night. Story from a friend of a friend. She, the mortician, met some guy at the bar. They hit it off and she gave him her number. Within a couple of days she finds out that the guy died in a car accident because his body ended up at her place of work. Before the funeral service she receives several calls from an unknown number and whenever she picked up there was no response. Eventually, she got the eerie hunch that it may be him and proceeded to address him by name. Tells him to pass in peace and to stop calling. It worked. A writing professor of mine used to work in small town journalism and decided to interview some folks from the local retirement home to get a close-up view of his town's history. One of his interviews was an ancient, retired mortician who told him a rather interesting story. Shortly before 1920, two teens were going to a school dance in a blizzard. The carriage they had taken got stranded and the boy went for help. The girl unfortunately froze to death in the carriage, in an upright, seated position. Apparently the mortician had to sit her in a rocking chair in front of the fire to thaw her out before he could go about his usual business. Uncomfortable? Being trapped in the morgue alone during a hurricane. Our morgue was basically in a basement type situation and the hospital was near a main waterway that flooded. I had to move all the bodies to the highest cabinets. Pray the generators would keep everyone cold and was standing on my desk for about 2 hours when someone finally came for me. Bizarre would-be drowned guy who was DOA and once locked up in the cabinet a tapping noise started coming from him. It was a crab that had made itself at home inside him and when it got cold he wanted out. Creepy was when we got some people who were doing bath salts and had eaten other people. They looked crazy even in death. I work in the industry. The creepiest thing I have seen would be one of my first pickups. There was a humidifier in the room, but I didn't know about it. I thought the deceased was still alive and wheezing. The most uncomfortable would probably be a guy in a halfway house style place and there were people everywhere. Just strange situation. Or a lady that was a crazy hoarder. Or the time someone died at a huge party in the front yard. You ain't experienced life until you see a 2+ week decomposed body that's been in the heat. I didn't know maggots could be so big. Have a colleague that had a person who had passed away 6 weeks earlier. Said it was mostly liquefied. I have to say it has been the most humbling experience personally. There are some bad eggs but overall most people are amazing and you really appreciate those people that have lived such good lives. Don't leave your family for granted. I see it all too often when someone dies. Family tear each other up over money and petty foods. Give your loved ones love and respect. Not a mortician, but there's a mortician YouTuber that I love. I had a pretty awful case with rape murder. Luckily the guy got caught but I'll leave it with he had a knife and wanted some more holes other than the original 2. My father was a funeral director in NY. They had to remove the wall of a house to get the body of an 800-pound man out. For the funeral, the giant casket was towed on a trailer. Nothing in school or prior experience prepares you for caring for a young child, especially one that is the same age as yours. Tiny suits are not meant to be burial garments. It is something you don't forget. The most bizarre happened when I was apprenticing. I worked with a senior funeral director on Sundays. Just me and him. I'd been working for about 2 years when he passed away suddenly from simultaneous kidney liver failure. The most surreal thing was transporting his body after the embalming was done back to the funeral home where we worked. Lady I work with used to pick up the bodies for the coroner. One time they had to collect a woman that was laying in a very hot attic apartment for a couple months. All her liquids ran out onto the floor and dried, and when they tried to pick her up she started coming apart like an overly tender turkey. Her co-worker sent her to the van to get more bags, and when she got back he had finished bagging the lady. Classy. Changed how I think about turkey. Oh man. I might be late but this is good. We picked up a suicide on a major holiday, Thanksgiving or Christmas, I can't remember. Took her back to the funeral home. Undressed her and had to wait for medical examiner. Family decides to cremate. We had dressed her for a viewing. Everything was normal. Later that day she was ready to be cremated. I put her in, started the machine and went back inside. I had to embalm someone else. About an hour in I heard like 5 loud pops. First thought was a pacemaker. Brain stimulator. Something I had missed. I let it finish, swept it into the tray, and a ducking small handgun came out. Now I had seen all of her. Seriously, where did she have that at? The only spot is inside her V. The question is why. It's been 10 plus years and I'm still WTF. Again, happy Christmas everyone. Do morticians ever sit around a body while eating a big sandwich like they always seem to do in movies, TV shows? Not a mortician but retired deputy, and my most bizarre dealings with a mortician was taking a report on a missing person. Turns out a corpse was stolen by family members to be interred in accordance to their traditional gypsy beliefs. They openly admitted taking the body, but we never found it, nor could we definitively connect them to the theft. They hung around for a month or so and disappeared one night. Very interesting peeps. Not a mortician here but a related story. My father passed away when I was quite young in a head-on collision with a logging truck. Safe to say the body was not in a good state. Here's the messed up part. My grandma, whose only child has died, busts into the funeral home and demands to see the body. The funeral director suggests against it due to his state. She wants to anyway. As he's bringing her in there says, "You'll want a chair for this." And she goes and pulls out a duck-kind disposable camera and starts snapping photos. Doesn't even bat an eyelash at what she's seeing. The story goes on to get even more weird, but that's for another time. Not a mortician story, but my dad was in the Coast Guard in the early 70s, stationed in San Francisco, between the Golden Gate Bridge and Bay Bridge. They would get a lot of jumpers, and the coasties had to retrieve the bodies. At night or in bad weather, they would sometimes take hours or even a day or more to find. One day they retrieved a body and the body was being eaten by crabs. Dad said there were more than a dozen crabs all over the body. The body was basically a big piece of crab bait. Some other coastie on the boat is pulling the crabs off the body, putting them in a cooler. Guy says to my dad, "My wife loves Dungeness crab and apparently was notorious for being the guy who claimed the crabs." My dad is a mortician. We had actually lived above the funeral and my life had been just like my girl. He has been a mortician for over 40 years and has tons of stories. The worst by far is the human soup guy. Apparently this elderly gentleman passed away while having a bath, with the water still running. He was living alone in the house with very little family. I don't remember how long he was in the bath before someone found him. My dad goes to pick up the body and it's human soup. The hot water constantly running and the amount of time caused his body to turn to mush. He said the smell was the worst he ever smelled. He got back to the office later that day and his boss told him to throw away his suit and he'd buy him another. So many. But you get used to it. Fat people purge when they die, and usually end up with vomit all over their face from the weight on their gut. I end up feeling resentful of some very overweight people because I know I will have to pick them up when they die, and there's a chance it'll throw out my back. Summertime equals maggots. Babies just look like they're sleeping. Very peaceful. Co-worker unknowingly picked up his own estranged son who had overdosed in a car. Picked up a 4-year-old boy in Batman pajamas. Don't ever forget that. That one was the worst. Also, since I have you, I've noticed an uptick in young teen suicides in the last year. If you have someone in your life who is a young teenager, or anyone really, check in with them. Let them know they're loved. I'm tired of picking up dead bullied girls. Transported a 60-year-old woman to the morgue after a severe car accident. She had ran into a large tree heading 75 miles per hour. Face was mashed in completely. After they sprayed the body, they found a tube of lipstick in her brain. Cause of death was putting on makeup while driving, i.e., lipstick. I may be too late here. I'm a forensic anthropologist and I go to crime scenes sometimes. We recovered the body of a murder victim after excavating her shallow grave. When I went to roll her over to put her in the body bag, she released gas from her back end right into my face. At least it was just gas. I had a friend who was dating a guy who worked in a morgue. One day she finds pictures that he had hidden which showed him having sex with different dead bodies. It's horrifying to think that someone can do this. But it's personally horrifying to think of someone raping my dead body. It's become a personal phobia. I am the superintendent of a cemetery and crematory, used to work as an apprentice at a funeral home as well, and have been reading this thread as I sit here winding down my afternoon in the chapel. Read a few comments about people seeing things and of course think to myself, thank God this hasn't happened to me. Right on cue, the old piano in the corner plays a single note. Afternoon feelings have changed slightly. Not a mortician, but I'll tell my story of encountering my first dead person. I think I was about 12 years old and I was on a vacation to Austria, a beautiful city with lots of these trams going up and down hill. We'd already heard the ambulances and after crossing a street with my father I noticed an ambulance and people climbing out of it frantically. Looking closer there was this mangled body that had gotten under one of the downhill trams. His face was mashed and there was so much blood pooled around him. My father quickly grabbed me by the arm and pulled me away. I still remember that clearly. During high school I got a job for the local funeral home as an assistant of sorts with responsibilities including picking up deceased from their homes, driving the hearse, digging graves by hand, cleaning up suicide scenes and passing out bulletins at funerals etc. Paid $25 an hour in the early 2000s, so can't complain. This one funeral I worked had a man who was cremated who was a bit of a drunk with a large extended family. Per his wishes, his ashes were put in a beer stein and his memorial service involved large amounts of ethanol in various forms. It was a happy service as these things go, until the deceased's best friend pulled out a karaoke machine and wanted to play a recording of a song that he and the deceased wrote while drunk. The name was I'm a Fat Ass. The sound was unintelligible except for the chorus which liberally used the song's title. Everyone breaks down crying and starts singing along. I excused myself to find somewhere to laugh quietly to myself. Worked in a mortuary for a few months because I needed a job and it was at night. My job pretty much was checking the bodies as they were brought in and put them in a cold storage. One night they brought in 2 bodies, back to back from a convalescing home. I didn't have time to put the first away yet, so I put it off to the side while I signed in the new delivery. The people leave and I go back to the first body and notice that it wasn't exactly as I left it. When I left it the body was flat on its back and when I got back it was sorta scrunched up. I backed the duck out of the room and just sat down. The mortician came out and saw me pale as a ghost. I told him what happened and he laughed. He then proceeded to explain to me sometimes the body will curl up after death because of rigor mortis and after that's done it'll go back to being limp. He proceeded to tell me that some cases are so bad that the bodies sit straight up. Duck that. He ended up putting the bodies away and I spent the rest of the night freaked out. I had a summer job one year when I was at university, nearly 40 years ago, as an orderly at the local hospital. I was assigned to the morgue and when a patient died on the ward we would go up and bring the body back down after the nurses had cleaned the person up and family had said their goodbyes etc. One day we had to get this woman who died during the night. She must have been 30 stone. Docs decided on an autopsy so we had to move her from the gurney type thing to the slab. As I was the young guy the experienced orderly said that I had to take the head. This woman was gargantuanly fat. She was also slippery like her skin was greased. I lost my grip and dropped her and her head smacked into the floor. We got her up on the slab and the doc came in and there was blood pooling under her head. The drop had cracked her skull open. He had a look and said that it was a good thing she was dead because that would have killed her. I work in forensics. Specifically as an entomologist, I extract insects from decomposing bodies to estimate the time of death or supplement existing evidence. It's as grotesque an occupation as you can imagine. The most odious cadaver was the partial skeletal remains of an 8-month pregnant mother who gave life to a plethora of maggots, botflies, and moth larvae were consuming her hair like some monstrous funeral shroud. The tiny bones of the baby were disintegrating under the unrelenting feasting of ham beetles as its flesh was too dry for maggots to find purchase. They preferred the malleable flesh of the mother's face and breasts. Observing the corpse, her exposed womb appeared to be giving birth. Many adult beetles were scuttling over her pubic bone and into the cradle of her pelvis. She was supine. Her limbs were not splayed in distress, but unfortunately her expression was indiscernible due to the divots of botflies imbued in the flesh of her cheeks. Then I began my extraction. It was a drug-induced suicide which encapsulated the tranquility of her and her child's death.